It's just been one of those things, It's like it's been stuck in my head. The Vadodara accident
Yeah.
with the law student
Oh, right.
makes you think.
For sure.
It's awful, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely.
One person dead, others hurt, and then the whole thing with the drug test.
Right.
It just brings up so many more questions, beyond the tragedy itself.
It really does. Like, how do we even begin to sort through something like this?
Exactly. That's what we're looking at today, like really trying to untangle this whole issue of proving someone was driving under the influence of drugs.
Right, because you'd think it would be simple.
You would. Positive test, open and shut, right?
Yeah, you'd think so, but it almost never goes that way.
It's so much more complicated.
Way more. Yeah.
So to really get into this, we've been digging into the reports from Vadodara,
Okay. Yeah.
especially how they're investigating this whole thing. There's this back and forth, right, between that first drug test they did, the rapid one,
Right.
and then what they do at the FSL, the Forensic Science Lab.
Yeah, the more in-depth analysis.
Exactly. And that's where I got stuck.
Okay.
Because I bet a lot of people are thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
If that first test shows drugs, why isn't that enough?
You would think, yeah.
So that's our deep dive today, folks.
Sounds good.
We're going to walk through how they figure out if someone was using drugs when they were driving, see how reliable these tests really are, what their limits are, and then the big question, why don't more of these cases actually end up in court even when there seems to be evidence?
Lots to unpack there.
Tons. So let's start with what happened in Vadodara. Get the facts straight.
Okay, so the accident itself.
Yeah.
It happened on March 13th. This law student, Rakshit Chaurasiya,
Right.
he was driving a Volkswagen Virtus going way too fast and ended up hitting a bunch of two-wheelers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's bad. A woman, Hamali Patel, she died at the scene. And 7 other people were hurt,
Look,
including kids, too.
awful.
Really terrible.
And they suspected he was intoxicated right away.
Pretty much, yeah. And what's interesting is that right after they took him in, they gave him that rapid drug test.
Yeah.
And it was positive.
Right. And that's what caught my eye, that detail.
Yeah.
Because it seems like that's it, right?
It does, but here's the thing, and this is where it gets tricky. That rapid test, while it points to something, it's not actually strong enough to use in court.
Really?
Yeah, the police have even said it's not legally admissible. It's more of a starting point,
Okay, so red flag.
Exactly. Like, hey, we need to look into this more.
Gotcha. And that's why they got the blood samples, right?
Exactly.
From Chaurasiya, the passenger, and another friend who had been with them earlier, sent them all to the FSL for a closer look.
Right, and that's where they'll get the evidence that could actually hold up in court.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So let's talk about those tests. Like, what's the difference?
Okay, so think of the rapid test. They usually use a swab from your mouth, right? It's like a quick check. Basically, it tells you if there are drugs from certain groups in your system. So we're talking like opioids, marijuana, stuff like meth, cocaine, could even be some prescription drugs. But it's not specific. It just says, yep, something from this category is here, but it doesn't tell you exactly what or how much.
Like a yes or no kind of thing.
Pretty much, yeah.
Interesting. And then the FSL test, that's different.
Very. That's where they use things like gas chromatography. It sounds super complicated.
It does.
But basically, it's a way to separate everything in the blood sample so they can see exactly what drugs are there and how much of each one.
Oh, okay.
That's the key difference, right? It's not just, hey, there's something here. It's this is exactly what's here, and this is how much.
So that's what makes it solid for court.
Exactly. It's like the difference between a breathalyzer and a blood test for alcohol.
Okay, that's a good analogy.
Right. The breathalyzer gives you a quick idea, but for the legal stuff, you need the hard numbers from a blood test. Same idea here.
Gotcha. Now, here's something I found really interesting. One of the forensic experts in Gujarat said something that seems kind of contradictory. He said that, technically speaking, proving someone used drugs is as easy as proving they had alcohol.
Technically, yeah.
But then, hardly any of these cases actually get convictions.
That's the head scratcher, isn't it?
Totally. So what's going on there?
Well, there are a few reasons. One big one is the legal limits. With alcohol, there's usually a specific amount you can have in your blood before it's illegal to drive.
Right.
But with drugs, it's often way stricter. Even a tiny bit of certain drugs, and you're in trouble.
So it's not about how impaired you are, but just the fact that it's in your system.
In a lot of cases, yes. Of course, how you're acting matters too, but just having it there can be enough.
Interesting. And what about how long they can detect it? Like, how long do drugs stay in your system compared to alcohol?
So generally, they can find drugs in your blood for about 24 hours.
Okay.
Which, weirdly enough, is longer than alcohol.
Really? I would have thought the opposite.
It is kind of surprising. Alcohol usually disappears from your blood after 16 hours or so. After 8, it's pretty much gone.
Huh.
But even though that window is 24 hours for drugs, timing is still super important.
Makes sense.
Because if they wait too long to get the blood sample, the amount of drug in the blood could be really low.
Right.
Maybe even too low for the test to pick up.
So it might be there, but they can't prove it.
Exactly.
Now, what about using hair and nails? I know they can test those too, right?
Yeah, they can. And you can actually see drug use going back way further with those, like up to 100 days.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. But there's a catch.
Okay.
For court, they pretty much always need a blood sample.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because the blood shows what was in your system right then when they took the sample. Hair and nails can tell them you used drugs at some point, but not necessarily when you were driving.
Right. So for proving you were impaired at that specific time, blood is the gold standard. So let's say they take that blood sample from someone like the driver in Vadodara. What happens to it next?
Okay, so first off, getting the samples is serious business. It's all done by the book, like according to the Indian Evidence Act.
Wow.
Yeah, there are rules about everything. They can even use force if they have to get that sample. And once they have it, they have to be super careful with it, right? Make sure it's labeled right, sealed properly, all of that.
Yeah, like in those crime shows.
Pretty much, because if there's any doubt about how they handled it, the whole thing could be thrown out in court.
Makes sense. And then it goes to the FSL for that gas chromatography thing.
Right, but it's actually really cool.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they call it non-destructive. Basically, they use this machine to separate all the different stuff in the blood
Okay.
so they can identify each drug and how much of it is there.
So it gives them a super detailed breakdown.
Exactly. And because they can measure it so precisely, that's what makes it strong evidence in court.
Makes sense. But that all takes time, right?
Yeah, it's not instant. It usually takes about a week to get those FSL results back.
Okay, so it's not just, oh, it looks positive, we're done.
Nope. They double check everything, run more tests, compare it to like standard levels to make sure it's accurate.
Wow, really thorough.
Super thorough. Because they have to be able to defend those results, you know?
Totally. So to recap, the rapid test tells you what group a drug might belong to.
Yep. Like, hey, this looks like an opioid.
But the FSL can actually pinpoint this specific drug.
Exactly. So instead of just saying cannabinoid, they can say this is this specific type of cannabis in the blood.
Oh, wow, that's super precise. Now, what about this secretion time I keep hearing about?
Okay, so that's about how long it takes for your body to process and get rid of a drug.
Right.
Every drug is different. Some leave your system faster than others. And the experts can use that information, along with how much of the drug is in the blood, to guess when someone might have taken it.
Oh, wow, so they're like detectives?
Kind of, yeah. Because they're trying to figure out if the person was high when they were driving, right?
Makes sense. And what about those cutoff concentrations?
Oh, yeah, so that's basically a limit. If the amount of drug they find is below that limit, the initial test might say it's negative.
So it might still be there, but just not enough for that first test to catch.
Exactly.
That's confusing.
Yeah, it's tricky.
And those limits are different for different drugs.
It can be, yeah. It all gets pretty technical.
So even if the rapid test says negative, it doesn't mean someone's in the clear.
Nope, not necessarily.
This is so complicated. I can see why it's hard to get convictions in these cases.
Yeah, there's a big difference between that first hint from a rapid test and the really detailed evidence you need for a conviction.
You have to prove not only that they used drugs, but that they were likely high when they were behind the wheel.
Exactly.
Okay, so back to the Vadodara case. They're still waiting for those FSL results, right?
Right.
What happens if they come back and show that the driver did have drugs in his system?
Well, the police said they'll use relevant sections of the law against him.
Okay.
We don't know exactly what that means, but it'll probably be about driving under the influence and maybe causing death or injury because of it.
Right, that makes sense.
And the police commissioner mentioned they're also looking at other stuff, like how the driver was acting after the crash and what he was saying.
Oh, yeah, I read that. He said it seemed like the driver was high.
Yeah, so they're not just relying on the test, they're building a case based on everything.
Okay, so to recap, we started with this horrible accident in Vadodara.
Right.
The rapid test gave them a clue, but we dove into why that's not enough. We talked about how those FSL tests are way more detailed and how they can actually prove what drugs someone used and how much.
Yeah.
We talked about why it's so hard to get convictions in these cases, even with the tests.
Absolutely.
And now we're waiting to see what the FSL report says about the driver in this case.
Right. That's going to be the key piece of evidence moving forward.
This whole thing really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, we have all this technology to detect drug use, and the laws are super strict.
Yeah, they are.
But still, we don't see a lot of convictions.
It's definitely a disconnect.
So what needs to change? Should we be stricter about how much of a drug is allowed? Should we speed up the testing process? Should we focus more on how people are acting, not just the test results?
Big questions.
Huge.
Yeah.
Like, how do we make the roads safer, but also be fair to everyone?
Yeah, there's no easy answer. It's about finding that balance.
Absolutely. And I think this case in Vadodara is a reminder of just how serious this is.
Totally. No matter what the substance is, driving under the influence can have devastating consequences.
We really need to understand how these investigations work, the limitations of the tests, and the challenges they face in court.
Absolutely. And then maybe we can start to figure out how to make things better.
For everyone.
Exactly, for everyone.